Shalom, shalom, and welcome. It's great to see everyone today to do some Pesach learning coming up very soon. Just want to call your attention to a class we have on Monday with Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Clausen on his new book, Jewish Ethics, the Basics. He just put out this book about a month or so ago and looking at contemporary Jewish ethics, and I hope you'll come learn with him on Monday and many other programs. Also one with Rabbi Truboff next week on Franz Rosenzweig, if you're free for that. But today we get to learn from a great scholar, Dr. Devora Steinmetz, who I've known for over 20 years. And we're thrilled to partner with BMHBJ and our dear friend Rabbi Yaakov Chaitovsky, who is going to introduce our scholar today. So over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here today. It's Erev Pesach almost. Dr. Devora Steinmetz is an internationally acclaimed teacher and scholar on the faculty of the Hebrew College Rabbinical School, the Mandel Leadership Institute. She founded Beit Rabban, a Jewish day school in New York, and her school was profiled along with her in Daniel Pekarsky's Vision at Work, the Theory and Practice of Beit Rabban. And she's written many scholarly articles on various topics covering Talmud, Midrash, Bible, as well as 2 books, From Father to Son, Kinship, Conflict, and Continuity in Genesis, and Punishment and Freedom, the Rabbinic Construction of Criminal Law. She is has been on the faculty of Drisha, JTS in New York, Yeshivat Hadar, and Havruta, a Beit Midrash at Hebrew University. We're in for a real treat this afternoon. Please give your attention to Dr. Devora Steinmetz.
Thank you. Thank you, Rav Shemsky. Thank you, Rav Shmuley. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and apologies for the mess in getting my audio set up. So what I wanted to do, and I obviously can't touch upon everything I would love to say on this topic in the short time that we have, but what I want to do is talk about what I think is kind of the core challenge of the seder, which is how to help us make the story of the Exodus our own. We actually tell the story of the Exodus several times a day. We say it when we say Shema, we say it when we say Kiddush. We mention the Exodus all the time. But there's a special challenge at the Seder night to not only remember it, to not only tell it as a history that we remember, but to talk about it as our own story. And I wanted to highlight this challenge by looking at the very beginning of the Magid section of the Hagada, which you have at the top of the screen here, right after the 4 questions, which is in theory the child asking the parents these questions. We tell the story in a very simple way. We actually tell the story of the Exodus multiple times in the Haggadah. I'll get back to a couple of the other times later. But we start with an extremely simply telling of the story, which I'll read in the Hebrew. You have the English underneath it if you want to refer to it. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim v'yotzienu Hashem Elokeinu misham biyad chazaka v'zura netuya. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and God took us out of there. That's actually a biblical quotation. I'll get back to that in a minute. And then we say, had God not taken us out, had God not taken our forefathers out of Egypt, we and our children and our children's children would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then it talks about how it's incumbent on us, even if we're very knowledgeable, to tell the story. And of course, the reason it's incumbent upon us, even if we're very knowledgeable, to tell the story is because it's not about knowing the story. We, of course, know the story. It's about accessing the story in a different way. And that is true for no matter how much knowledge one has, it's still a challenge to have this other kind of access to the story, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I want to point out a couple of things about this first passage. What we're doing here in this passage is, and what I did was I bolded the part of the passage as a biblical text. So this first line, Avadin hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim, is a quotation from the book of Deuteronomy. We have the quotation right underneath over here. And if you look at this passage here in the book of Devarim, you can see that it is presented as the answer to a question. The book of Devarim, which is, of course, Moshe talking to the people, says when your child asks you in the future saying, what are all these laws about? You should say to your child, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim v'yotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazaka. But actually, when you look at this passage, it doesn't end with this line, with the verse that we quote up here. It continues on. God did signs and wonders against the Egyptians. And it concludes with this line over here, V'otanu hotzi misham, and us he took out of there in order to bring us, to give us to the land which God promised to our ancestors. So what I want to point out for starters is that when we tell this story at the very beginning of Magid, in quoting the Devarim chapter 6, where the Torah says what we should answer our child in the future, we actually only quote one of the three verses that the Torah gives as the answer to the child. And what I think is interesting about that is, I'm going to scroll down a bit for a second, is that actually in the Talmud, Rava, Talmudic sage, says, actually, you have to say, Ve'otanu hotzi misham. You have to say Ve'otanu hotzi misham. What is Ve'otanu hotzi misham? It is actually this. Can you see when I highlight? Give me a thumbs up. Yeah. So it's this. What Rav is saying is that in the Hagada, you have to say not only Avadim Hayinu, but you have to say this first, Ve'otanu hotzi misham. Now, I'll talk in a minute about why we don't say Ve'otanu hotzi misham, but let's first think, why do you think Rava might think it's important to say this verse, Ve'otanu hotzi misham l'man ha've'otanu? What does that add to the passage that's not already said in the previous verses? Anybody just unmute and speak up. What does that verse add?
To take us to the land of Israel.
Great. So Harold says it adds, we already see up here, right? God took us out of there, right? But here it says that God took us out of there in order to bring us to the land that God had promised to our ancestors. So that's one thing, right? Mentioning coming to the land. Okay, what else does this verse add to what we saw before?
Well, they're both in first person, but I guess adding Ve'otanu hotzi misham sort of puts more of a first person point on it with the Ve'otanu.
Yeah, exactly. So in Avadim Hayinu, that is a first person verb, we were, right? But there's something about this verse which is emphatic, right? The word order is not the natural Hebrew word order. It actually puts the object of the verb first, right? It doesn't say V'Hashem hotzi otanu. It says Ve'otanu hotzi, right? We, God took out of there. So there's an emphasis here on the we. It was us. And I think what's interesting is that when we look back at Avadim Hayinu actually not only doesn't quote the Ve'otanu verse, but it actually, when it sort of parses this verse in the next two lines, it says, it talks not about us, but about our ancestors, right? So first we say we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and God took us out of there. But then it says, and had the Blessed Holy One not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, then we and our children and our children's children would be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. In other words, the Haggadah immediately takes the God took us out of there, not to being about us, but to being about our ancestors. And what it says is, it's very important that God took our ancestors out, because had God not taken our ancestors out, we would still be slaves. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest here is that at this point in the Haggadah is understanding us as being interested in this story, not as the story that happened to us, but the story that happened to our ancestors. And that has implications for us, right? Our history, our past has implications for us. But to say that our history has implications for us is different from saying that we ourselves were in this story. And what's interesting is that this verse, which Rava says we have to say, we actually do say in the Haggadah, but we don't say it here, right? We don't say it right where you would expect it, right? It's as if you knew the biblical text by heart, you would be expecting at the very beginning when we say Avadim Hayinu to also say, and us he took out of there, but we actually stop mid-sentence, right? We don't say, and us he took out of there. And what we do is we actually say it at the very end of Magid. So this is the very end of Magid, the Bechol Dor V'Dor passage, which we say just before the blessing that concludes Magid. So this is the last narrative, right? This last paragraph of Magid. In every generation, a person must see themselves as if they left Egypt, as it says. I'm going to skip for a second. It quotes a verse, which I'll get back to, from the book of Exodus. And then it says this. Lo et avotenu bilvad ga'al HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was not our ancestors alone that the Blessed Holy One redeemed. Rather, also us. There's the otanu verb word, right? Rather, also us, God redeemed with them, as it says, and now you have this verse. V'otanu hotzi misham. It was us that God took out of there in order to bring us, to give us to the land which God swore, which God promised to our ancestors. In other words, the very beginning of Magid and the very end of Magid actually are one sentence that we interrupt with all of Magid, right? We start by talking about the Exodus, but we don't say, and it was us, until we get to the very end of Magid. And I want to use that as a framing. It's actually a frame for Magid, but I want to use it as a framing for the core challenge of the Seder, of the Haggadah and the Seder as a whole, which is how can the Seder, how can the Haggadah, how can we help move ourselves from remembering our history, which we do every day, to being able to say it was us, and to be able to actually see ourselves in the story, which is what we say here, right? We are obligated to see ourselves as if we left Mitzrayim. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Jacob, go ahead.
I was just wondering about, if the Haggadah doesn't want to start with us being freed until the end, like wants to build from being slaves to being freed, even though it hints that we would get freed. I don't know if it wants to put us in first person until the end.
So you're saying that something a little different from what I'm saying. I'm saying that really we're supposed to see this as our story, but it's hard for us to enter into that, and the Haggadah is trying to move us to that. And you're saying that really something else, that the Haggadah, even though it's already said we got out of there, it wants us to sort of be in the story of enslavement and move us to the story of freedom, to the experience of freedom. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but I think they're related. I think going from Gnut to Shavach is one way, like building the drama is one way of putting ourselves in the story.
Yes, and we'll talk about that as well. Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions before I continue? So I want to stay with this Bechol Dor V'Dor paragraph for a second and point to the other verse that it quotes, which is this one, right? It says, in every generation, a person must see themselves as if they left Egypt, as it says. And here it quotes a verse from Exodus, which also talks about telling your children. Jacob, I've never met your baby before. So it says, right, you shall tell your child on that day, saying, right? And then this second part of the verse is sort of untranslatable, but for our purposes, I'm just going to put a translation out there. This is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. The part that I want to emphasize is the for me, Asa Hashem li. And this verse, right, is what the Haggadah here is bringing to demonstrate, right, that you have to see yourself, Asa Hashem li. So you have two verses in Bechol Dor V'Dor that ask us to see the story in first person. The first verse, V'higadu L'Vincha, is from Exodus. When your child asks you, this is what you should say. And the second verse from Devarim, where Moses is saying, in the future, you should tell your child, V'higadu L'Vincha b'yom ha'hu. And you should say, V'otanu hotzi misham. This verse here, the first one from Shmot, right, is actually the verse from which the notion of Haggadah is derived. Right? V'higadu L'Vincha, that is the source of the idea of telling the story of Magid. And we'll get back to this verse a little later. That's actually not the verse I want to spend a couple minutes on. I want to say something about this verse. So as I mentioned, this verse is from the book of Deuteronomy. We have it here, right? It's this passage. And something that is mentioned a lot, but I want to say something about it anyway, is the fact that in all the different times that the Haggadah introduces a biblical text that tells the story of the Exodus, it never actually uses a text of the story from the book of Exodus. Right? We have a verse, we have this version here, Avadim Hayinu, which is from the book of Deuteronomy. Later on, we'll have a telling of the story that we take from the book of Joshua. And then even later in the Haggadah, we have a telling of the story that we again take from later on in the book of Deuteronomy. So this is the famous thing that people point out. We don't actually tell the story by using a quotation from the book of Exodus. And a very good reason for that, probably the best reason for that, is that in order to tell the story from the book of Exodus, you would need a lot of material, right? The story in the book of Exodus is said over the course of many chapters, and these other retellings of the story are very brief. And so if you just want a quick retelling, you take it from something that tells a much shorter version than the book of Exodus. But I want to say something else about that, which is that each of the tellings of the story that we quote, meaning each biblical passage that tells the story that we use in the Seder to tell the story, is actually a retelling of the story. In other words, this first one, in Devarim chapter 6, is Moshe telling the people, when your child asks you in the future, this is what you should tell them. And I'll show similar things about the other passages in a minute. But what I want to point out about this is, who's Moshe actually talking to in the book of Devarim? And as he's telling the people, your kids are not going to know anything about this, so you have to tell them the story of the Exodus. But who's Moshe actually talking to in Sefer Devarim when he tells them this? When your children ask you, who's you, Jacob?
The generation that's going to enter the land.
Yeah. So what do we know about that generation?
The vast majority of them did not experience the Exodus.
Exactly. Right. So when Moshe tells the people, hey, when your children in the future ask you about this, you have to tell them, and then he tells them the story to tell them, right? Moshe's actually talking to people who themselves are the children of the people who experienced this, right? This is the second generation. This is not the generation of the Exodus. So the point is, Moshe is telling people who were not there that they have to tell people who were not there. And we, in our generation, are essentially being asked to tell our children a story, but actually we're being asked to tell our children a story that we weren't there for either, that we are the children who are being told the story. Am I being completely unclear? Or somewhat clear? Or very clear? Just give me a thumbs up if you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Meaning, what I'm suggesting is that we always think of the Seder as focusing on children, which is absolutely true, right? We have the 4 children, we have the children's questions at the beginning. But what I want to actually point out is that we are the children, right? We are supposed to tell our children, but actually we are the children, right? When Moses tell the people to tell the children who weren't there about this, we are those children. We are the people who weren't there. Not only that, but the people that Moses is talking to, instructing them to tell their children themselves are the children who were not there. Am I making any sense? Yes, give me a sign. Is this clear? In other words, the challenge of saying I was taken out of there is already embedded in the very first retelling of this story, right? When Moshe tells the people, tell your children, we were taken out of there, that we, right, is already the people who were not there. And so every time we choose a biblical passage in which to tell the story, where somebody is saying, hey, God took me out of there, it turns out that in each of those occasions, the person who was saying, God took me out of there, was actually not there. And so the Haggadah from the start is giving us models of people who were not there, telling their story in first person as if they were there, which is the very same challenge that the Haggadah is putting before us. How can we bring ourselves to tell this story as a first person story, as if we were there? Does that make sense?
Dr. Steinmetz, I see Elaine has her hand raised.
Wait, say again. I couldn't hear whoever just spoke.
It's Alex. Elaine has her hand up if you don't mind taking a question.
Oh, hey, Elaine.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. Just an observation about Deuteronomy in general. Deuteronomy throughout seems to have the language that brings us all in. There are different places where the language is found about you being there today. And in particular, you were at Sinai, right?
Exactly. So I just highlighted a verse here, which you can see. This is exactly the verse you're talking about. This is actually from the chapter just before the Avodim Hayinu chapter, where Moses says, Lo et avotenu korat Hashem habrit hazot, korat Hashem et habrit hazot, ki itanu anachnu ele po hayom kulanu chayim. It was not with our fathers that God made this covenant, rather with us.
Us.
Today,
Right.
Us, these, here, today. And notice the form of this verse is actually very similar to this. Lo et avotenu bilvad. At least there it says, right? It wasn't with them. It wasn't only with them, rather with us as well.
Right.
And it's the same form. It's the same form as V'hishamda. Lo echad bilvad, right? Not only one, but in every generation. So already, you're right, the book of Deuteronomy is already playing off that idea that you who were not there actually were there.
Right, and to me, that's the genius of Deuteronomy, that although Moses ostensibly is giving his final speeches to the people who are going to cross over and he won't be with them to guide them, all throughout Deuteronomy, we're brought in, at this time. I wish I could remember, but there's language that runs through about bringing us into that time as if it were present and we were present.
Yeah.
And it's a way. I mean, I find it the genius of Deuteronomy that in every generation we are brought into the story, and if you study it, it just enriches your life and brings you in to Torah.
Yeah, exactly. And that is actually the model that the Haggadah is working with. So I want to mention just a few ways. Again, we can't be comprehensive here, but a few ways that I think the Haggadah tries to help us. So I mentioned a couple already, right? One is giving us models of first-person narratives. Okay? People who were not there, who are able to themselves enter into the stories if they were there, as the book of Deuteronomy itself does. Another thing has to do with something that who was a herald, I think, said before when I asked, what's the difference, right? What does this verse add? So one thing we've been emphasizing is ve'otanu, right? But Harold mentioned something else, which is that this verse actually continues the story. It's not just that God took us out of Mitzrayim, but God took us out and then, right, with the goal of bringing us to the land. And so in a sense, right, when we only say Avadim Hayinu, we're sort of stopping the story in the middle. And in fact, every biblical passage that we quote in the Haggadah in order to tell the story of the Exodus, every single one in its original biblical context concludes with coming to the land. And every time we tell the story, we truncate the biblical passage and end it before coming to the land. Now, one possible reason for that is because the Haggadah, over the course of many generations, has been recited at a time when we were not in our own land, and so taking that part off sort of makes it more accessible to us. But I think a different reason is that, when I was a kid, I had a hard time. My worst subject was history. I like to think that's because I had terrible teachers, but that's actually not why. I had excellent teachers. The reason I think was because history was told as a story whose ending we knew. And it was only when, as an adult, I started to sometimes read books about history and sort of try to enter into the not knowing what happened, right? That it became very riveting. Right? Because once you know the end of a story, right, it's the end. It sort of says the end, you close the book and it's over. But if you can sort of enter into the middle of the story, you can actually access it as something in progress that you can sort of enter into the experience of. And I think when we sort of decide, when the Haggadah decides not to ever finish the story, but to sort of truncate the story, to end the story in the middle, that's another way that it invites us into the story, right? It becomes a story in progress. Not that it's a closed book, but that's a story in progress that we can try to enter into. So find ourselves at different points in it. And I'll point that out when we look at some of the other passages as well. I want to look at just a couple of the other passages that we use to tell the story, and just point out some things that the Haggadah does with those. So this is the third or fourth, depending how you're counting, passage that the Haggadah uses to tell the story. This is the passage later in the book of Devarim, from chapter 26, and it's Mikra Bikurim. It's the passage that the Torah tells us to recite when we bring our first fruits to the temple. So the Torah in the book of Devarim now is looking far ahead. When you come to the land, you bring your first fruits to the special place, and you make the declaration that begins Arami Oved Avi. Sorry, this should not be bolded. And notice that this passage actually includes the word higadati, right? Which is the same word, Hagada tel bincha, right? Make a declaration. And the declaration begins, Arami Beit Avi, Vayerid Mitzrayim, my ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt, etc. I'll get back to the biblical passage in a minute. I just want to mention something that I'm not going to get to talk about, but that is critically important, which is that this is the final passage that the Haggadah chooses to tell the story. And in this passage, we not only recite the passage, but we do midrash on the passage. We offer an exegesis word by word of the passage, and that's another way. Again, I can't elaborate on this now, but that's another way. The midrash on this passage is another way that the Haggadah sort of invites us into the story, right? Just to interpret the story and make it our own. But what I want to point out about this passage at this point is simply that here too, you have somebody. This is not even the generation that Moses is talking to, right? This is a far future generation after they've come to the land, after they've settled down, after they have begun to produce agricultural produce, and they're bringing their bikurim, their first fruits, to the temple. And the language that they use is Arami Oved Avi, right? My ancestor, first we're talking about our ancestors. My ancestor was wandering Aramean. He, third person, he went down to Egypt. He dwelt there, a small number of people. He became there a great nation. And then all of a sudden, the verse turns to first person, right? And the Egyptians harmed us and afflicted us and put upon us difficult labor. And we cried out to God, and God heard our voice, and God took us out of Mitzrayim. So here's another example of where we're choosing a passage, again, from the book of Devarim. But here, the person, not even the generation of the book of Devarim, which is the children of the generation of the Exodus, but the generation after that, far in the future, and still that generation is able to come. And obviously, they were never in Egypt, right? Here, they're not only came to the land, but they were bringing their first fruits to the temple, and they're able to make this switch from the first verse of the passage to the second verse, from this happened to our ancestors to we called out, the Egyptians afflicted us, we called out, God took us out of there. And notice that here too, as in the Avadim Gideon passage, we stop before the end. These last two verses, we don't say the verses that say God has brought us to this place. So we truncate the story again, my suggestion, inviting us into the midst of the story rather than putting an end point to the story. But what I really want to focus on is the second passage that we use to tell the story. And this passage is a passage from the book of Joshua. It's from Joshua 24, the very end of the book of Joshua. And what's interesting about this passage, for starters, is that this passage in the book of Joshua is parallel to Moses' speech in Devarim. Right? Just as Moses, before he dies, all of Sefer Devarim is Moses before he dies, telling over the people's story to the next generation. Here is Joshua at the very end of his life, just before he dies, telling over the story to the next generation of that time. So it's a very similar thing, right? Helping the next generation access the story. And what he says is, Vayomer Yoshua Ka'am, Joshua says to all the people, scroll this down a little bit, Ka'amar Hashem al Yisrael, Be'ever hanahar yoshvo techem elam, terach avin avraham binachor, ve'yavdu elohim acherim. On the other side of the river, your ancestors lived forever, Terach, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods. I'm actually going to translate that as they served other gods. Vayavdu, they were in the service of other gods. I'll get back to that. I took your father, I took Avram from the other side of the river, and I caused him to walk throughout the entire land of Canaan, and I gave him a lot of descendants, and I gave him Yitzchak. I gave Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Esav. And I gave Esav Har Seir as an inheritance. Jacob and his children went down to Mitzrayim. I'm reading from the book of Yeshua. I sent Moshe and Aaron, and I smote the Egyptians, and then I took you out of there, and I took your ancestors from Mitzrayim, etc., etc., etc. So that's the passage in the book of Joshua. How much of that passage do we actually quote in the Haggadah? Well, the answer is right here because I bolded it. we actually, when we quote this passage in the Haggadah, end right here. V'Yaakov uvanav Yerdu Mitzrayim. That's in fact very strange, right? Because not only don't we talk about coming to the land, which is in this verse, and not only don't we talk about the exodus from Egypt, we don't even talk about the enslavement of Egypt, right? We actually end our quotation of the story when Yaakov and his sons go down to Egypt. So what's going on here? So here's how we quote the passage in the Haggadah. Here's the passage, the bolded part, and we quote it with a tiny little introduction. Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu v'achshav kervanu hamakom avodato. At the beginning, our ancestors were worshippers of idols, or I'm going to translate serving idolatry. And now the omnipresent, the Makom, brought us close to his service. Right? So you have the word Ovdei and Avodato. Right? We were servants of, or slaves of Avodah Zarah, and God has brought us close to his service, as it says. And then it quotes the beginning of that passage. Again, stopping the story before the Exodus, stopping the story even before the enslavement. So I think what's happening here is a couple of things. Number one, the Haggadah is telling us that if we want to think about enslavement and freedom, there's a different kind of enslavement and freedom. We think of enslavement to Pharaoh and freedom as God taking us out of the enslavement of Egypt, God delivering us from Egypt. But this passage actually is highlighting a different kind of enslavement, again, using that word avdut, slavery, enslavement, in relation to whom do we serve? Do we serve Hamakom, or do we serve idolaters? And actually, when you look at the narrative that is being quoted from the book of Joshua, it actually is a narrative of being brought out of something and being crossed over the water, a body of water, right, in order to come into God's service, right? Joshua says, right, your ancestors lived on the other side of the river, and they were, and now I'm going to translate it my way, they were slaves to other gods. But I took your ancestors from the other side of the river, and I brought them to the land of Canaan. Right? So the story that's being told here, right, is the story of Abraham as a story of deliverance from slavery, from taking him out of one place, crossing him over the water, and bringing him to a new place, right? Taking him out of a place of service of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry, and delivering him from that and bringing him over, right, to the place where he will worship God. And that is what the introduction is emphasizing, right? Originally, they were the servants or the slaves of other gods, and now God has brought us close to his service. So I think that there are two things happening here at once. One is a re-understanding of enslavement. There's a suggestion that if it's hard to access, it is hard to access, I think, for us, an experience of actual enslavement. But the Haggadah here is inviting us to think about what other kinds of enslavements there might be. And it's giving us an example of another kind of enslavement, right? Being enslaved to idolatry as opposed to being in service of God. So by expanding the notion of what it means to be enslaved and what it means to be delivered from enslavement, the Haggadah, I think, is here inviting us to imagine other ways in which we might access this experience of being a slave and being free. It's not just, when I remember in first grade, we would sing Avadim Hayinu and, carry the burdens over our shoulders and imagine ourselves with the bricks. That's hard to do. But if you expand the notion of what it means to be enslaved, we have access points to the experience of enslavement and deliverance from slavery. And that's, I think, what this passage is doing by completely ignoring the actual story that we think we're supposed to be telling, right, which is the story of enslavement of Pharaoh and deliverance from Mitzrayim, and instead highlighting the pre-story, which is being an Oved Avodah Zarah and then becoming an Oved Hamakom, right? The Haggadah is allowing us to imagine other kinds of ways in which we might be enslaved and finding ourselves within some other kind of narrative of enslavement, which I think we can probably all do, or at least do more easily than imagine ourselves as actual slaves in Egypt. But the other thing that I think is interesting that's happening here, besides the expansion of meanings of enslavement, is that once we notice that this story, that Avram's own story, is a story of deliverance, of God taking Avram from the place where they were kind of enslaved to idolatry, bringing him over the body of water and bringing him to the promised land to God's service, what we realize, if we were to kind of think ahead, is that by the time we get to what we think of as the real story of enslavement in Exodus, the story of enslavement in Egypt and deliverance from Egypt, that actually that's already happened before. In other words, it's not that there's a story of enslavement in Exodus, that's the story in the book of Exodus, right? But actually, by the time that story comes around, right, by the time we are enslaved to Egypt and God delivers us from Egypt and crosses us over the sea to God's service and to freedom, that's already a redoing of a paradigm, right? It's already a redoing of something that has already happened. Am I being clear? Give me a thumbs up if I'm making sense. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And what that does then is not only kind of expand the meanings of enslavement, but it suggests that it's not only that we have something that happened in the past, the story of Exodus, and we're being asked to see ourselves in that again, right? To see ourselves as behold Dor, but that by the time the story of Exodus happens, it's already behold Dor, right? It has already happened to a previous generation of our people. Right? It already happened to Abraham. And so what this becomes, by the time we imagine ourselves, if I put a ... right here, right, and you read the rest of the story, and you get to the story of the Exodus, that by the time you get to that, you understand that that's already a redoing of something else, that this is something that happens literally b'chol dor v'dor by the time it already happens. Right? It's already kind of a repeat story. And
I just want to say same thing with Lavan, right? By looking back to Lavan, what happened to us in Egypt is like a repeat.
100%. And so in the Midrash that I don't quote here on Arameo Veravi, right? I mentioned before that the Deuteronomy 26 passage, right? That there's this Midrash on it. So the Midrash starts with say Lavan Mabikesh Lavan Arameo, so right? That go out and see what Lavan the Aramean tried to do to Yaakov, right? Because Pharaoh only tried to do this, but Lavan was even more destructive of our people, right? So there too, it's already saying, right, that this happens again and again. And of course, right before this passage in the Haggadah, we have the V'hishamda, right, that it always happens again and again and again. Actually, we don't have time for this, but if you do a close reading in the book of Genesis of the story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan, you will see that all of the language of the Exodus, of affliction, of God seeing the affliction, of enslavement, all of the language that appears in the book of Exodus to describe the enslavement shows up in the story of Yaakov in the house of Lavan. And I'll just give a teaser, which I can't develop, also in the Haggadah. So this is the Mitchila passage that we were just reading from the book of Joshua, right? Right after that, we have the Brit Ben HaBitarim, right? This is Genesis chapter 15, where God says to Avram, you should know that your descendants will be a stranger in a land which is not theirs, and they will be slaves to them, and they will afflict them, right? They will enslave them, afflict them for 400 years, etc. And right after that, we say V'hisha Amda, right? Again, that same language. It was not one alone who tried to destroy us. Rather, in every generation, they tried to destroy us, and God saves us. And that's what leads right into love. And hey, you can see that, right? Because by the time the Exodus came around, it's not just what I just said about the Mitchila passage, that Avram was delivered from enslavement, but actually, Yaakov himself was delivered from enslavement, right? But notice this, that right before the V'hisha Amda, what's the V'hi? So Svaya is helpful. It says this promise. This promise has stood for us. What promise has stood for us? Well, the promise is the promise of right here, the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the promise that God makes to Avram in chapter 15. And this language that God says to Avram, Yadoa Teda Ki Ge Ye'ezarecha Be'eretz Elohim, you should know that your descendants will be strangers in the land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and afflict them. So that language, Carol, and again, this is a teaser, so this might not make sense, but if you ever want to try to work this out, I will have laid the groundwork for you. This language actually plays out. It is these words, Ki Ge Ye'ezarecha V'avadum V'inu Otam, the fourth generation, right? This language plays out both in the book of Exodus and in the life of Yaakov and his sons. And think about it. Yaakov's sons are the fourth generation from Avram. So when it says here, it doesn't include this verse here, but when it says in the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the fourth generation will return here, right? That can refer to the story of the Exodus. It can also refer to Yaakov and his sons, the fourth generation from Avram, coming back after becoming virtual slaves in the house of Lavan. So you're right? That is what the Haggadah is doing. The Haggadah is saying that by the time you get to the story of the Exodus, we've already heard the story over and over again. So it's not just that we are challenged to sort of project that into the future, but the Haggadah has already shown us, right, that this was something that was always happening, that the Exodus was already a redoing of enslavements and deliverance that have happened before. So let me just recap some of the things that I've put out there in terms of trying to help us access the story. One is the notion of stopping the story in the middle, right? Rather than taking us to the end of the story where it's all nicely packaged and done with, right? Stopping before the end of the story, sort of inviting us into the midst of the story. One is the fact that every time we are choosing a biblical passage, we're choosing something that is not the story itself, but the retelling of the story by somebody who was not there, but who is able to tell the story as their own story in first person. So giving us models of people who are able to find themselves in the story and make that story their own. A third thing is the idea in the story from in the passage from Joshua, right? 2 points here, right? One is the notion of the expansion of the meanings of enslavement so that we can access other kinds of enslavement and freedom from enslavement than the literal one of enslavement in Egypt. And the other is by focusing on the prehistory rather than on the story that we think we're supposed to be telling, letting us know that actually way before the story of enslavement in Exodus, there was a story of enslavement in Exodus. So we're already sort of putting out there the idea that the enslavement in Exodus is a paradigm that can in fact happen b'chol dor v'dor. So those are some of the things, some of the ways that I think the Haggadah is trying to kind of nudge us, not so much nudge us, but nudge us right, into being able to actually say V'otanu, that this was our story. There are a couple of others which I'll mention briefly, and then I want to read a quotation that I think picks up on this theme very nicely, and then I'll open for some questions. So a couple of things which I'll just mention briefly is one of them is the Midrashim on Arameo Beit Avi. We talked about Arameo Beit Avi before. That is the passage, right? The Mikra Bikurim, the passage from Deuteronomy 26 that the pilgrim is to say when they bring their first fruits to the temple. I mentioned before that, well, I don't have it on this page, that each of these words or phrases is kind of parsed, and the Haggadah gives a correspondence, right? So when it says Vayreyu Oton HaMitzrim, it then quotes another passage that exemplifies that. V'yanunu, it quotes another passage that exemplifies this. My spouse has some very brilliant Torah on what each of those midrashim is saying, but I want to say something much, much more simple than that, which is that by stopping and doing midrash, by stopping and making correspondences between things like Vayitnu Aleinu Avodah Kasha, and then going back to the book of Exodus and quoting a verse that elaborates on what that difficult labor was, that we're sort of that the Haggadah is sort of helping invite our imagination in the literal sense of imagination, meaning imagining, making an image in our minds, right? It's very easy to read words and just sort of gloss over them. When you stop and saying, what does avodah kasha mean? What did that look like? Oh, they had to make bricks, right? They had to go gather the straw to make bricks. That just stopping and making us notice and helping us call images to mind, right? Helping us envision what it actually looked like and felt like. So imagination in the sense of to call up images and to make it real. I think that's another way that the Haggadah invites us into the story. And one other way actually goes back to that verse that we quoted before, Ba'avur ze asa Hashem li b'tzeti mitzrayim, right? That's the verse that we have in, I'm sorry that I'm scrolling so much, but right here, right? In Bechol Dor V'Dor, we quoted this, Otanu hotzi misham, right? The end of that Avadim Hayinu passage, which we did not say when we expected to say it. But we also had this other verse from Shmod, V'higadah telabincha bayom hahu le'mor. Again, this is the verse that lays out the commandment lahagid, to tell, to say the Haggadah, right? That verse continues, Ba'avur ze asa Hashem li b'tzeti mitzrayim. And whatever that means, the passage here is highlighting the li, right? God did this for me. But interestingly, this passage is actually quoted 3 other times in the Haggadah. I'm not going to mention 2 of them, but I'll show you one of them. It's mentioned right after the 4 children, right over here. Yachol mirosh chodesh. We just quoted the verse, V'higadah telabincha bayom hahu le'mor. And then it says, maybe you should tell your story, tell the child anytime from Rosh Chodesh. I think Rosh Chodesh is this Sunday, something like that, right? So maybe we should start the Haggadah anytime from Rosh Chodesh. No, because it says Bayom Hahu. Maybe you got to tell the Mincha Bayom Hahu on that day, right? On that very day. So then it says, well, maybe if it's Bayom Hahu, maybe we should start telling the story before the night of the seder. And this is no, because it says Ba'avur zeh. In Rabbinic Midrash, zeh, biblical use of the word zeh, is always thought to indicate pointing. Ba'avur zeh, like HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. And this Midrash that God actually showed Moshe what the new moon looks like. So zeh is always seen to indicate pointing. So ba'avur zeh lo amarti, you can only say ba'avur zeh, right, at the time that there's matzah and maror placed before you. In other words, that the parent is to tell the story to the child, or really to themselves, by pointing to the matzah and maror. So this is another way, and this is obvious, right? But this is another way that the Haggadah is trying to help you make the story your own, is to it's a really unique moment where the story is being told in conjunction with actual rituals that we do and foods that we ingest, right? That you can only say Asa Hashem li, right? That God did this for me. You can only access that li, that the me-ness, right? It's my story, when you're actually in the context of having matzah and maror before you, of eating the matzah and the maror in conjunction with telling the story. So that's another way that the Haggadah is helping us access this story as our own. So I want to end with a quotation, and I'll open up if people have questions or comments. This is a passage I like a lot from the New American Haggadah. If anybody's seen the Haggadah, there's I think 4 different people who write different kinds of sort of commentary on it, and one of them is Rebecca Goldstein, who's a novelist, and she says the following. She says, Haggadah means narration, and tonight's celebration insists on the moral seriousness of the stories that we tell ourselves. Stories are easily dismissible as distractions, the make-believe we craved as children, losing ourselves in the sweet enchantment of as if. As if belongs to the imagination, that wild terrain governed by no obvious rules. But tonight we are asked to take this faculty of the mind, so beloved by children and novelists, extremely seriously. All the adults who have outgrown story time are to be tutored tonight with the physical props meant to quicken our pretending and the ways of the child to guide us. I'm going to pause there for 1 second. What I want to highlight is that we actually are the children. Right? Remember, when the book of Deuteronomy tells the people to tell their children who were not there, we are actually the children who are not there. So we're not just telling our children, but God is asking us to enter into that childlike stance ourselves, right, to awaken the imagination. And that's what she is picking up on, right, the ways of the child to guide us, not just that our children guide us, right? Not just that in telling our children it helps guide us, but that we are to seek out the ways of the child as a guide to accessing the story through our imagination. Back to the quotation, it is not enough to merely tell the story, but we must live inside of it, blur the boundaries of our personal narrative so that we spill outward and include as part of our formative experiences, having lived through events that took place millennia before we were born. But the tradition also insists on possessing tonight's story in more general moral terms, the Torah reminding us never to oppress the stranger, since you know the soul of the stranger, having been strangers in the land of Egypt. This story that we relive tonight is meant to grant us knowledge of the soul of the stranger, and there is nothing more universal than that soul and the knowledge of it, and it is only the tutored imagination that can lead us to it and to the compassion that it yields. Tonight is the night that we sanctify storytelling. So I love that idea of the tutored imagination, right? That our imagination needs instruction. And that is really what the Seder is trying to do and what the Haggadah is trying to do. It's to tutor our imagination. It's to teach us how to use our imagination to sanctify storytelling so that we can access the experience of the story. And as Goldstein suggests, right, to access the compassion that identifying with the story can generate. So I'm going to stop there and open to any questions or comments that people might have.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think we have time for maybe one question. If there's anyone that didn't get a chance to speak yet, then we would love to hear from you. Hi, Rabbi.
Hi, thank you. Wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I think Rabbi Soloveitchik once dealt with the question of why don't we use the passages from Exodus? Why do we use the Deuteronomy passage? And he said what you said, which is it's the only other account it's the only account in the Torah that is in the first person. And it does happen to be with someone who knows the story, but according to the tradition, may not have actually been in or walked out of Egypt. And that's the model. That's the model for us. That's how we are brought in to the storytelling. So I just want to share that Rabbi Soloveitchik and you are on the same page.
And just to note that all the retellings that we do are first person retellings of people who are not there, right? So it's not just the Armia Review passage, but the Avadim Hayinu passage and the Book of Joshua passage, right? All of them are first person retellings. Great. Thank you. Thanks for mentioning that.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, Dr. Steinmetz, for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to learn with you. And thank you all for learning with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.